The lawyer cleared his throat once, adjusted his reading glasses, and changed my life in 11 words. The estate, in its entirety, passes to the firstborn son, Conrad Whitfield. That was it. No pause for effect, no softening of tone. Just 11 words delivered in the flat, practiced voice of a man who had done this before and expected no complications. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk and felt the room rearrange itself around me. My father's house, the one on Ashford Drive with the oak tree in the front yard that he had planted the year I was born, gone. His company, Whitfield Industrial Supply, which he had spent 30 years building from a single warehouse into a regional operation with 14 employees, gone. The investment portfolio, the vehicles, the accounts. All of it, in 11 words, handed to my older brother Conrad, who sat 2 chairs to my left with an expression he was working hard to keep neutral but couldn't quite manage. The smirk kept finding the corners of his mouth. My stepmother Diane sat across from me, examining her manicure. She did not look at me once. The lawyer, a man named Gerald Foss, slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "For you," he said. "Your father left a personal letter." I took it. It was light. Almost nothing. Then I opened it, read 3 paragraphs in my father's careful handwriting, and stopped at one line that made everything in the room go very quiet. "Trust no one in this room." The extended family was gathered in the sitting room when we returned from the office. Aunts, uncles, 2 cousins who had driven up from Richmond. They had the particular energy of people waiting for news they already suspected. When Diane walked in first, her posture carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just watched a plan complete itself, they understood immediately. The condolences began flowing in Conrad's direction. I stood near the doorway holding my envelope and my father's letter and tried to process what had just happened in a room that had stopped making space for me. Then Diane turned and looked at me for the first time all morning. "I hope you're not going to make this difficult," she said, loudly enough that every conversation in the room paused. "Your father made his wishes clear. Being ungrateful about it only embarrasses yourself." Several people looked at their shoes. One of my aunts made a sound that might have been protest but didn't become one.
I didn't respond.
I was still thinking about the letter.
I was still thinking about that line.
Gerald Foss had followed us back and was speaking quietly to Conrad near the fireplace. At one point, Conrad laughed at something Foss said. I watched the lawyer carefully. He was nodding, gesturing toward a document Conrad was reviewing. And then, just once, Foss glanced across the room in my direction. Our eyes met for less than a second. He looked away first. He looked away the way people looked away when they were carrying something they didn't want read on their face. I went back to the house the following morning. I told myself it was to collect some personal things, photographs, a few books, items that had been mine long before any of this. The truth was I wanted to get into my father's study. He had spent more hours in that room than anywhere else in the house. If there was anything that explained what had happened, the will, the letter, the line I couldn't stop reading, it would be in there. The lock on the study door was new, bright brass, recently fitted, the kind you bought at a hardware store and installed in an afternoon. I stood in the hallway staring at it for a long moment. Conrad appeared at the end of the corridor. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked like he had been expecting this. You should have called first, he said. This is still my childhood home, I said. Was, he corrected. He said it without particular cruelty, just as a statement of fact, the way you corrected a grammatical error. Then he told me I had a week to collect anything personally mine before he would need the space. As I walked back through the front hallway toward the door, I passed the window that looked out onto the driveway. A white moving van was parked outside. 2 men were carrying filing boxes from the side entrance, the one that led directly from my father's study to the back garden. They were moving quickly, with the focused efficiency of people working against a timeline. I stopped walking. I watched them for a moment. Then I kept moving because I understood that whatever was in those boxes, I had just run out of time to reach it through the front door. I read my father's letter so many times over the following week that I had memorized it without trying to. It was 3 paragraphs of the kind of careful, measured language my father used when he was being precise, when he wanted to be understood exactly and not approximately. He wrote about love. He wrote about his hopes for my future. And then, in the final paragraph, between a sentence about his mother's silver watch and a sentence about the importance of patience, were phrases that didn't belong. Not in tone, not in rhythm, not in the vocabulary my father used when he spoke or wrote. The phrases felt inserted, placed between sentences that flowed without them, like objects left in a room by someone who didn't live there. I read those phrases again. The arrangements are as they should be. All that matters is settled. My father never used the word arrangements in that way. He never used settled as a final statement. These were not his words. Someone had added to this letter, or replaced portions of it, before it reached me. And underneath those inserted phrases, in the final line of the final paragraph, written in my father's unmistakable pressure and slant, the line that had stopped me cold the first time, was the only part of the letter I was certain he had written himself. Check the blue ledger. I didn't know what a blue ledger was. I didn't know where one would be. But my father had put those 3 words in a letter he knew would reach me, and he had put them there deliberately. That meant somewhere there was something I was supposed to find. My father's company, Whitfield Industrial Supply, had operated out of the same building on Garrison Street for 22 years. I went there on a Wednesday, not to the main office, but to the smaller annex where the accounting department worked. I asked the receptionist for Warren Cole, my father's head accountant, a quiet man in his 60s who had been with the company for nearly as long as the company had existed. Warren came out to the lobby, and when he saw me, something moved across his face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief. It was closer to dread. We sat in his office with the door closed. I asked him directly, had my father expressed any concerns in the months before he died? Warren was quiet for a long time. He straightened a stapler on his desk. He moved a pen from one side of a notepad to the other. Then he said, carefully, that my father had been troubled in his final months. Troubled about what, I asked. About people close to him, Warren said. About whether the people closest to him were acting in his interest or their own. He used the phrase internal betrayal. He said my father had used it first. Then Warren stood up. He said he was sorry for my loss. He said he hoped things would work out. He said he had a family of his own and a job he needed to keep, and he wasn't in a position to get involved in whatever this was becoming. He shook my hand at the door. As he did, he held it a half-second longer than necessary, and his eyes went briefly to the window across the parking lot. I followed his gaze. Nothing there, but the gesture had been deliberate. He was pointing at something without pointing at anything. My father had rented a storage unit on the edge of town for as long as I could remember. Unit 14 at Clearfield Self-Storage, a low concrete building off Route 9 that smelled like motor oil and old cardboard. He had paid the annual fee every January, and after he died, no one had thought to cancel it. Or if they had thought to, they hadn't gotten to it yet. I still had a key. I had found it on my father's spare keyring, which I had taken from the kitchen hook the morning I went back for my things. The unit held the accumulated overflow of a working life, old business files, tools, boxes of documents from the company's early years, equipment that was too worn to use and too meaningful to discard. I spent 4 hours going through it systematically, box by box, shelf by shelf, working my way from the back wall forward. The blue ledger was in a metal toolbox on the bottom shelf, wrapped in a cloth that smelled like machine oil. It was a standard accounting ledger, the kind used before everything moved to computers, hard cover, blue cloth spine, about 150 pages of columns and entries in my father's handwriting. I sat on a crate in the middle of the storage unit and read it from the beginning. Most of it was straightforward supplier records, payment logs, margin notes from his early years. But starting about 3 years before his death, the entries changed. Amounts appeared without clear attribution. Initials appeared where names should have been. And certain transactions that should have been followed by receipts or confirmations simply stopped, as if someone had removed the pages that came next, leaving only the record of money going out and nothing to show where it had gone. I spent 2 days cross-referencing the ledger entries against everything I could access. Old bank statements my father had kept copies of in the storage unit, company financial summaries from the years I had worked briefly at Whitfield, and public records I pulled from the county courthouse. The initials in the ledger appeared in 3 consistent clusters across a 14-month period starting roughly 2.5 years before my father died. DW appeared in connection with 11 transfers totaling just over $200,000. CW appeared in 8 entries totaling roughly $140,000. And GF appeared 4 times, in smaller amounts, but always timed within days of the larger transfers. DW Diane Whitfield. CW Conrad Whitfield. GF Gerald Foss. My father had been tracking money leaving his accounts for over a year before he died. He had been documenting it carefully, in a ledger he had hidden in a toolbox in a storage unit that only I had reason to access. He had known. He had known what was happening, and he had known who was doing it. The will had not been the beginning of the theft. The will had been the end of it, the final act of a plan that had been running quietly for years while my father was still alive to be deceived. I closed the ledger and sat in my apartment in the dark for a long time. Then I thought about Gerald Foss and the will reading and the 11 words that had handed everything to Conrad. The lawyer hadn't just witnessed the fraud. The initials said he had been paid for it. I requested a private meeting with Gerald Foss through his firm's scheduling line, describing it as a matter related to my father's estate. He agreed to 15 minutes on a Thursday afternoon. His office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind of space designed to communicate permanence and authority, dark wood, diplomas in matching frames, a desk that probably cost more than my car. He greeted me with the controlled warmth of a man who had spent decades managing difficult conversations professionally. I sat across from him and told him, without raising my voice, that I had found the blue ledger, that I had cross-referenced the entries, that the initials were identifiable, that the transaction timing correlated directly with movements in my father's personal accounts during a period when his health was declining and his capacity to monitor his own finances was reduced. I watched his face while I spoke. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk and looked at me for a moment with an expression of professional regret, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis he had rehearsed. He said the ledger proved nothing admissible. He said accusations of this nature, made without proper legal standing, could constitute defamation. He said I should speak with a lawyer of my own before making claims I couldn't support. His voice was level throughout, but his left hand, resting on the edge of the desk, developed a slight tremor about halfway through his response that he couldn't fully control. He was not frightened of what I had. He was frightened of something else, something I hadn't named yet, something that had more reach than a storage unit ledger. I thanked him for his time and left. By the end of the month, the practical realities of my situation had arrived in full. My father's house was no longer accessible to me. The small stipend I had received from his company during the years I worked there had stopped. Conrad had assumed operational control of Whitfield Industrial Supply and had made it quietly clear to anyone who asked that my involvement in the business was finished. I was 27 years old, living in a one-bedroom apartment I had been subsidizing with savings that would last approximately 4 months, with no job, no family support, and no legal representation I could currently afford. I had 2 things of value: the letter, with its altered paragraphs and its 3 deliberate words, and the blue ledger, wrapped in cloth, stored in a bag under my kitchen table. I thought about what Gerald Foss had said about admissibility. He was right that a personal ledger wasn't enough. I thought about Warren Cole and the way he had looked at the parking lot across from his office window. I thought about the moving van and the boxes. I thought about the initials and the offshore trails that the ledger entries hinted at, but didn't complete. I had evidence of a shape. I didn't yet have evidence of the full picture. And I understood clearly that if I tried to fight this now, broke, without legal backing, against a lawyer who had managed the paperwork and a family who controlled the assets, I would lose. Not because I was wrong, but because being right wasn't enough. Not yet. So I did something that felt wrong in every emotional sense and right in every strategic one. I put the ledger back in its bag, picked up my phone, and started looking for a job. The decision happened quietly, the way the most important decisions usually did. I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with the blue ledger in front of me and a job listing open on my laptop, an entry-level operations coordinator position at a mid-sized industrial supply firm in Pittsburgh called Hartwell Distribution. The salary was modest. The role was junior. It was exactly the kind of position I would have considered beneath me 2 months earlier, before 11 words had rearranged everything. I thought about my father. I thought about the fact that he had known what was coming and had prepared for it not by fighting them directly, but by leaving me a trail. He had hidden the ledger. He had stored the real will. I was now almost certain there was a real will, somewhere they couldn't reach. He had written 3 words in a letter and trusted me to find what they meant. He had not acted from emotion. He had acted from patience and precision. I would do the same. I made a list. Not of grievances. I had enough of those to fill the ledger twice over. A list of what I needed: legal standing, financial independence, industry expertise,
Time.
a network that operated in the same world as Whitfield and Hartwell and Gerald Foss's firm. I needed to become someone they couldn't dismiss, couldn't threaten, couldn't reduce to a letter and a locked study. I needed to outgrow them so completely that when I came back, the ground would already have shifted beneath their feet. I closed the job listing. Then I opened it again and submitted the application. Hartwell Distribution was not a glamorous place to begin again. The Pittsburgh warehouse was loud and poorly heated in winter, the kind of building where the fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that became invisible after a week and noticeable again every Monday morning. I was the youngest person in my department by a decade, and I had arrived with a background that invited skepticism. The child of a company owner who had ended up in an entry-level role was either incompetent or carrying baggage, and my new colleagues couldn't yet tell which. I let them wonder. I kept my head down in the way that looked like submission but was actually accumulation. I learned every system, every supplier relationship, every inefficiency in the receiving and fulfillment process. I stayed late not to be noticed for staying late, but because the quiet hours were when the building's real structure became visible, where the decisions actually got made, where the money actually moved, where the gaps between how things were supposed to work and how they actually worked became apparent to anyone paying attention. I had grown up watching my father run a business. I understood the bones of this industry in a way that formal training didn't fully account for. But I kept that understanding to myself and let people underestimate me. I had learned, in the past months, that being underestimated was not a disadvantage. It was a condition you could use. Every person who assumed I was unremarkable was a person who wasn't watching what I was actually doing. And what I was actually doing, quietly and consistently, was learning everything I would eventually need. The opportunity arrived 14 months into my time at Hartwell, in the form of a struggling logistics division that nobody wanted to manage. The Southeast Fulfillment Unit had been underperforming for 2 years. Late deliveries, supplier disputes, a contract renewal coming up that the company was quietly expecting to lose. My direct manager mentioned it in a team meeting as an example of a problem without a clear solution. I asked after the meeting if I could look at the division's operational data. My manager looked at me the way people looked at offers they expected to regret, but couldn't find a reason to refuse.
She said yes.
I spent 3 weeks analyzing the division's fulfillment patterns, supplier response times, routing inefficiencies, and contract terms. The problems were solvable, not easily, not quickly, but solvable with the right sequence of changes applied in the right order. I wrote a 12-page operational proposal and submitted it through my manager to the division director. 6 weeks later, I was running a task force implementing it. 4 months after that, the Southeast Fulfillment Division had improved its on-time delivery rate by 31%, retained a contract renewal, and reduced its supplier dispute backlog by 2/3. The division director shook my hand at a company meeting and said my name in a room of senior managers for the first time. I noticed how different it felt to have your name said by someone with power in a room full of people. I filed the feeling carefully. I was going to need to remember it. The discovery came from a research habit I had developed during my time at Hartwell, tracking regional industrial supply trends, watching which companies were expanding and which were contracting, following the movement of major contracts in the sector. My father had mentioned, years before he died, a regional logistics corridor he had wanted to develop. A mid-Atlantic distribution network connecting smaller industrial suppliers to institutional buyers, hospitals, universities, municipal contractors, who needed reliable supply chains but were too small to negotiate directly with national distributors. He had called it a gap in the market. He had been quietly building toward it in his final years. Then he died, and the project disappeared. I had assumed Conrad had abandoned it out of disinterest. What I found, 18 months into my time at Hartwell, was different. The project hadn't been abandoned. It had been blocked. A legal injunction, filed through a shell entity connected to a law firm that shared office space with Gerald Foss's practice, had effectively prevented any competitor from entering that distribution corridor for a period of 5 years. The injunction was due to expire in 14 months. Whoever moved into that corridor first when it expired would have first-mover advantage in an underserved market worth, by my rough calculation, somewhere between $8 and $12 million in annual contract value. My father had seen it. The people around him had seen it too, seen it clearly enough to have him blocked from it before he died. The corridor was still there. The clock was running. And for the first time since the will reading, I felt something shift from raw determination into something more precise. This was not just an opportunity. This was the door my father had been trying to open. I left Hartwell 2 years after I arrived. I left with 3 things I hadn't had when I came: a reputation in the regional industrial supply network, a clear understanding of how to build and operate a distribution business, and a specific market opportunity timed to a legal window I had been monitoring for 26 months. I registered Holloway Supply Partners in Delaware on a Thursday morning, using savings I had built carefully over the previous 2 years, supplemented by a small business loan from a Pittsburgh lender, whose terms were fair because my business plan was detailed and my operational track record at Hartwell was documented and verifiable. The first 18 months were the hardest work of my life. I was running operations, managing supplier relationships, writing contracts, handling compliance filings, and doing the financial modeling myself because I couldn't yet afford to hire the people I needed for all of those functions simultaneously. But the Mid-Atlantic corridor opened exactly when I had calculated it would, and I was positioned in it before anyone else moved. The first year's contract value came in at $4.2 million. The second year it doubled. By the end of year 3, Holloway Supply Partners had 11 employees, contracts with 7 institutional buyers, and a regional reputation for reliable delivery and clean contract management. Meanwhile, I had been watching Whitfield Industrial Supply the way you watched a building you suspected was quietly losing its foundations. The news, when it came, was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. The Mid-Atlantic Regional Supply Conference was held every October at the Convention Center in Baltimore. I had attended the previous 2 years as an exhibitor, building my network and establishing Holloway's presence in the industry. This year, I was a headline sponsor. My company's name was on the program, on the banners near the registration desk, and on the lanyards that every attendee wore for 3 days. I was standing near the Holloway exhibit space on the first morning, reviewing the afternoon panel schedule, when I saw Conrad across the room. He had aged in the way that stress aged people, not dramatically but visibly, around the eyes and in the set of his jaw. He was standing near a much smaller exhibit space with 2 people I didn't recognize, and he was scanning the room with the expression of someone taking inventory of who was present and what it meant. Then he saw the banner. The large one, near the entrance, with the Holloway Supply Partners logo and the title sponsor designation. I watched his eyes move from the banner to the room, and then, slowly, to me. He had not recognized me immediately. That told me something. It told me that the version of me he had last seen, broke, locked out of my father's house, holding a letter with nothing else, was the version he had filed away as permanent. What he was looking at now didn't match the file. His confidence didn't collapse. But it cracked, the way old plaster cracked when the wall behind it shifted, a small fracture that told you the structure underneath was no longer what it had been. Gerald Foss found me at the conference reception on the second evening. He was impeccably dressed, as always, and he carried himself with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades moving through rooms like this one. But he crossed the room toward me, which meant he had decided to make this approach, which meant something had changed in his calculation of me since our last meeting in his office. He introduced himself as though we hadn't met, which I found interesting. I let him do it. He asked about Holloway Supply Partners with the careful interest of someone who had already looked it up. He mentioned that his firm had several clients in adjacent industries and that he was always interested in connecting strong regional operators with the right opportunities. He used the word partnership twice. He smiled at appropriate moments. He was, in every surface detail, a polished and reasonable professional networking at an industry conference. But underneath the surface, I could read the calculation running. He had underestimated me once. He was recalibrating now, trying to understand what I knew and what I intended to do with it, trying to position himself on the right side of whatever was coming. I smiled at the right moments. I answered his questions without answering them. I said partnership opportunities were always worth exploring and that I'd have my assistant follow up. Then I excused myself and walked away, and I did not look back, and I filed the encounter carefully because it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. He was nervous.
And nervous people made mistakes.
I went back to the blue ledger that winter for the first time in several years. I had kept it exactly as it was, cloth-wrapped, stored in a fireproof box in my home office, untouched while I built the foundation. I needed to do something with it. Reading it again with fresh eyes and 4 years of additional industry knowledge changed what I saw. The transaction gaps I had noticed the first time, entries that started but had no corresponding receipts or confirmations, pointed toward something I now understood better. The pattern of timing and amount was consistent with the structure of an offshore holding account, not a domestic account that had been closed or moved. An offshore structure, likely established through a foreign entity, that would have required a specific kind of legal facilitation to set up. The kind of facilitation that a lawyer like Gerald Foss, with his firm's international practice division, was precisely positioned to provide. I pulled up the firm's public filings and cross-referenced them against the dates in the ledger. One entity appeared in both, a Cayman Islands registered company called Westbridge Advisory Holdings, incorporated in the same quarter as the first ledger entry bearing GF's initials. Westbridge had no visible public activity and no listed principals. But it had a registered agent whose name appeared in 3 other Foss firm documents from the same period. The offshore account wasn't a theory anymore. It was a thread. And I now had enough of it to start pulling. Warren Cole called me. I had not contacted him since our meeting at the Whitfield offices years earlier. I had understood then that he was not ready, that his fear was real and his reasons for it were legitimate. But he called me on a February evening, and when I answered, his voice had the quality of someone who had been holding something for a long time and had finally decided to set it down. He said he had watched my company grow. He said he had kept track of what I was building and what I was doing. He said my father had been a good man who deserved better than what had been done to him. Then he said he had something he had been keeping since my father died, something my father had asked him to hold and asked him to give to me when the time was right. Warren said he thought the time was right. We met the following Saturday at a diner off Route 9, 20 minutes from the Clearfield storage unit. He brought a sealed envelope and a USB drive. The envelope contained a 4-page handwritten summary in my father's handwriting, documenting the fraud he had been tracking, the transfers, the offshore structure, the lawyer's involvement, and the timeline. The USB drive contained digital backups of financial records my father had quietly copied from the company system in the 18 months before he died. Together with the ledger, together with the Westbridge filing I had traced, and together with the transaction records I had assembled over the previous year, the picture was no longer incomplete. It was complete. It was documented. It was, as Warren said quietly over coffee, enough. I did not go to the authorities immediately. I had learned from my father's example and from 4 years of watching how this industry operated that timing was everything and that the right stage mattered as much as the right evidence. What I had was powerful. What I needed was a setting in which it could not be dismissed, minimized, or quietly managed by the people it exposed. That setting arrived in the form of Whitfield Industrial Supply's financial distress. Conrad had been running the company badly for years, not maliciously, just incompetently, in the way that people ran companies they had inherited rather than built. 3 major contracts had lapsed. A key supplier relationship had collapsed over a payment dispute. The company's bank had issued a formal notice of covenant breach on its primary credit facility. Whitfield was not yet insolvent, but it was close enough that the family needed a solution urgently. The solution that presented itself, quietly, through an intermediary in the regional supply network who had no idea of the history involved, was an acquisition offer from a well-capitalized regional operator with a strong balance sheet and a clean compliance record. The operator was interested in Whitfield's supplier relationships and geographic footprint. The acquisition would require full financial disclosure as part of due diligence. The acquiring company was Holloway Supply Partners. I gave them 3 weeks to consider the offer. Conrad called the intermediary back in 10 days. The negotiation meeting was held at a law firm in Baltimore, neutral ground, the acquiring party's choice. I arrived 20 minutes early and was already seated when they came in. Conrad, Diane, and Gerald Foss entered together. It took Conrad a full 3 seconds after sitting down to process that the person across the table was me. Diane recognized me immediately. I saw it in the slight stiffening of her posture, the way her expression became more controlled rather than more open. Foss sat down last and arranged his papers with the careful deliberateness of someone buying time to think. I had prepared for this moment for a long time, but what I felt when they sat down was not what I had expected. Not triumph, not anger, not even the cold satisfaction I had imagined. What I felt was clarity. A clean, steady sense of being exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what the evidence and the patience and the years had prepared me to do. I opened the meeting by thanking them for their time. I outlined the acquisition structure in plain terms, Holloway's offer, the valuation methodology, the transition timeline. Then I explained the due diligence requirements. Full financial disclosure, going back 5 years. Complete documentation of all asset transfers, intercompany transactions, and any offshore holdings. All legal fees and advisory relationships disclosed. Conrad looked at Foss. Foss looked at the documents. I watched them and said nothing. They needed my money, and I already owned their secrets. The due diligence clause was on page 11. It required complete financial transparency as a condition of closing, full disclosure of all transactions above $10,000 over the preceding 5 years, documentation of all related party transfers, and a representation and warranty covering the accuracy and completeness of all provided records. Foss read it twice. I could see him reading it. He looked up and said the disclosure requirements were broader than standard market practice and suggested narrowing the scope. I said the scope reflected my company's compliance standards and was non-negotiable. A pause. Foss looked at Conrad. Conrad was doing the math, the acquisition price against the alternative, which was a bank calling its loan and a company going into default proceedings. The math wasn't difficult. The acquisition price was the only viable path. The terms seem aggressive, Foss said carefully. I looked at him directly. Standard practice for a transaction of this size, I said. Any competent operator would require the same. His jaw tightened slightly. Conrad picked up the pen. I watched him do it. He didn't read page 11 carefully enough to understand what the disclosure clause actually committed him to, what it would require him to produce, and what producing it honestly would reveal. He signed the agreement with the confidence of someone who had spent his life making decisions without reading the fine print. He had learned that from his mother. He had learned it, I suspected, from watching other people pay the consequences of their carelessness. Now it was his turn. The due diligence process took 6 weeks. My legal and financial team conducted it with the systematic thoroughness of people who had been briefed on exactly what they were looking for. On the 41st day, during a documentation review session at the Baltimore office, I asked for a brief recess and then returned to the conference room carrying a leather portfolio. I set it on the table without explanation and opened it to the first page. Before we continue with the closing process, I said, there are some discrepancies in the disclosed financial records that need to be addressed. I placed the Blue Ledger summary on the table first. Then the USB drive's contents, printed and organized. Then the Westbridge Advisory Holdings Incorporation documents and their connection to the Foss firm. Then the 4 pages in my father's handwriting, the fraud documentation, dated and signed. Then the bank transfer records Warren had preserved. I laid them out in order, methodically, without raising my voice, without looking at Conrad or Diane or Foss individually. I let the documents speak. The room was quiet for a long time after I finished. Foss's face had lost its color in a way that was almost medical, the rapid draining of someone whose body was processing something their professional training hadn't prepared them for. Conrad pushed back from the table slightly, as if creating physical distance from the documents might create legal distance. Diane was perfectly still. My attorney spoke. He said the materials would be referred to the appropriate authorities. He said the closing process was suspended pending review. He said everyone present should consult their own legal representation immediately. What followed was not dramatic in the way that movies made these moments look. There were no shouted confessions, no breaking down in hallways. What there was over the following 3 months was the steady, grinding machinery of legal process doing what legal process did when the evidence was sufficient and the documentation was clean. The fraud charges were filed by the state attorney's office following a referral from my legal team. The federal wire fraud component, connected to the offshore transfers and the interstate nature of the transactions, brought a second layer of investigation. Gerald Foss was the first to retain separate legal counsel from Conrad, which told the investigators everything they needed to know about where the internal fault lines were. Conrad's legal team issued a statement suggesting that Foss had acted outside his authority and without full client knowledge. Foss's legal team issued a counterstatement. Diane retained her own attorneys separately from both of them. The 3 people who had sat across from my father's lawyer on the day of the will reading, united by a shared interest in what they had taken, began, in the specific pressure of a formal investigation, to behave exactly as people behaved when their shared interest became a shared liability. They turned on each other with the particular efficiency of people who had never actually trusted each other to begin with. I watched it from a distance, through my attorney's updates, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Mainly, I felt tired. And underneath the tired, something that was not quite sad but was adjacent to it, the recognition that none of this had been necessary. None of it had needed to happen. The original will surfaced 4 months into the investigation. My father had filed it with a probate attorney in Richmond, a woman named Catherine Marsh who had no connection to the Foss firm and whom my father had apparently visited quietly, without telling anyone, 8 months before he died. The will was dated and notarized. It named me as the primary heir of the Whitfield estate, including the house, the company, and the investment accounts. It included a specific provision for Conrad, a structured buyout of his minority interest over 10 years at fair market value, which was generous and which suggested my father had tried to be fair to everyone even as he prepared for the possibility that they might not be fair to him. The will also included a letter of instruction referencing the blue ledger and the storage unit, written in the same precise language as the letter I had received, but complete, unaltered, without the inserted phrases that had replaced what my father actually wrote. Catherine Marsh testified that my father had been clear-minded and specific at the time of signing, that he had told her he was concerned about the integrity of his primary estate documents, that he had asked her to hold the will and release it only under specific legal circumstances that the fraud investigation had now triggered. My father had known. He had not been able to stop what was coming, but he had built the mechanism for correcting it quietly and patiently, and he had left me the map. I walked through the house on Ashford Drive on a Thursday morning in late October, the year my father's estate was finally, legally, fully transferred to me. The oak tree in the front yard had grown in the years I had been away, broader at the base, the branches reaching further than I remembered. The house itself needed work. Conrad had not been a careful steward. There were things that needed painting, a section of the back porch that had been neglected, the study that had been emptied and never properly restored. I walked through each room slowly, without rushing. I stood in the doorway of my father's study for a long time. The new lock Conrad had installed was gone. The room was empty, but intact, the bones of it unchanged, the window that looked out over the back garden still catching the morning light the way my father had always said it did. I was not celebrating. There was nothing in this that felt like celebration. What had happened to my father? The fraud, the manipulation, the final years of his life spent watching people he trusted take from him while he tried to document the evidence they'd need to answer for it. That was not something a legal victory erased. What it was, I decided, standing in his study in the October light, was corrected. The record had been corrected.
The truth was on paper.
The people responsible were answering for what they had done. And the work my father had left unfinished was mine to finish now, on my own terms, with his name on the building and his ledger in a fireproof box and his oak tree still growing in the front yard. They had taken everything from me once. The difference was I knew exactly how to take it back. And I knew now how to keep it.